You know what? It wouldn't be my presentation. We didn't have to.
Or anybody's ever.
Well, me in particular. So my name is Maria. I work here at the Quam Visitor Center, and I know that probably many of you may have hiked to Dana Common in nicer weather, but however, since it's like -5 out degrees, and we have like 2 feet of snow, it's a good idea. Maybe take a little virtual hike to Dana Common. Okay. Hello? All right. So I'm gonna have to actually, for those of you, yeah, actually have to come a little closer here, figure this out. I'm sorry.
Are you explaining that?
Yeah, I think you probably want to. Sorry about that. Oh, see, now I'm in your way. Feel free to move. I have this is the first time anyway, whatever. Moving on. Hopefully the volume is clear for everybody at home. And I found a new position here in room. And we're gonna finally take our virtual hike to Dana Common. No, it is not my friend today. It was working just a minute ago. I checked it. Oh, there we go. All right. So for those of you who don't know, I work for the Department of Conservation and Recreation, the DCR. So DCR actually is has sort of 2 different divisions. State Parks manages the state parks, obviously, State Parks Division. So places you might be familiar with, like the Esplanade or Nickerson Beach or out this way, Otter River State Park, for instance. However, we here at Quabbin, we're in a separate division called the Division of Water Supply Protection. So our job is very different. Our mission is focused on protecting the land around the Quabbin, the Wachusett, and the Ware River watersheds, as well as the water, the source water. We work in conjunction with an agency called the Massachusetts Water Resource Authority. So we protect the land and the source water. They treat the water and distribute it to people's houses. If you've never seen a map of the Quabbin Visitor, of the Metropolitan Water Supply System, this is it. And it is the water supply for 2.7 million people. So we're here at Quabbin, we're at the south end. There is actually an aqueduct called the Chicopee Valley Aqueduct that takes water directly from Quabbin and serves Chicopee, Wilbraham, and South Hadley Fire District number 1. So if you've heard anybody tell you that towns in this part of the state don't get drinking water from here, that's actually inaccurate. There are 3 communities that chose to join the system in the 1950s. However, the system was built for the metropolitan area, and the majority of the water does travel from Quabbin through a very deep aqueduct, deep underground. It's about 200 feet underground, travels about 25 miles underneath the Ware River watershed to the Wachusett Reservoir, which was built in the 1890s. From Wachusett, the water travels to a treatment plant, which is in Northborough. And from the treatment plant, the water then goes to the greater Boston area. So there's 50 communities in greater Boston, 3 communities out here, and altogether that's 2.7 million people. So probably the big thing that's part of this story is that unlike a lot of other major municipal water supplies, we are actually an unfiltered water supply. So you could call it unfiltered, which is how the EPA refers to us, or you can refer to it as naturally filtered. So all of our water is first protected by the land around it. And that requires management of activities on the watershed land. And that's the best, actually one of the best ways to keep water clean. So Quabbin Reservoir is the largest piece of the water system. And it's 81,000 acres of land and water. And we're going to be talking about Dana. So we're going to be talking only about Quabbin at this point. So there's 25,000 acres of water, 56,000 acres of forest. So a lot of times the reservoir is, when they talk about the history, they talk about the drowned towns, which is kind of inaccurate because half of the towns aren't underwater. The land of the towns is in the watershed land around the water. This area, the Swift River Valley, along with the Ware River Valley, there's a lot of interest in them as drinking water supplies really early on. From 1895, in fact, they were identified as areas that might make excellent drinking water reservoirs for the metropolitan Boston area. So this map is actually from 1895. It shows you a proposal that was drawn by engineers that worked for the Massachusetts Board of Health. And if you look at this, this is what they estimated would flood if the Swift River was dammed. And it is very, very close to what a modern map is today. So they really liked the Swift River Valley, like I said, even from 1895. In the early 1920s, when the conversation about expanding the drinking water supply for metropolitan Boston came up, engineers were sent out to survey the land. And the Swift River had a lot of things, or Swift River Valley, also known as the Quabbin Valley, had a lot of things going for it. All right, move this out of the way. The Swift River was very clean because there wasn't a lot of manufacturing in the valley, or not a lot of major manufacturing. Small population at the time we're talking about in the 1920s, it was approximately 2,500 people. And there was no major industry. But one of the biggest reasons is the topography. So the actual shape of the valley, the engineers considered it a remarkable topography. That's because the river had 3 branches. It actually still does have 3 branches. And then they came together in Enfield as one river and flowed south valley into the Chicopee River. So this map over here is actually the engineer's proposal map. So on the map, you can see brown lines. Those are former roads in the valley. And you can see the dark blue. So there's some ponds. Here is what Pottapog Pond looked like originally. You can see Quabbin Lake here in Greenwich, and the branches of the Swift River. So the west branch, the middle branch, the east branch. Down here in Enfield, it became one river and flowed south down into the Chicopee River. So the engineers proposed building 2 structures down here at the south end, the Windsor Dam and the Goodnoe Dike. And those 2 structures would impound the waters of the Swift River and cause it to back up and flood the low-lying area. And the valley had a natural hills going around it. And so the engineers said, okay, it's like this natural bowl shape that would collect the water and it would be protected. So, from their point of view, it was sort of minimal construction work down here at the south end. In 1926, the Ware River Act was passed, which I'm not going to talk about that at all, but Ware River Watershed was created at the same time as the Quabbin. In 1927 is when the Swift River Act was passed, and that is when the process of creation of this water supply, which equaled the death of the 4 towns in the valley. So, one of the things that is really interesting about this project is that the valley would be transformed. So before they actually started the construction, there was a company that was hired to take aerial photographs. And this is one of the ones they took of the south end of the valley. So here's the Swift River. Here's the railroad. And then this area right here is where they plan to build the Windsor Dam. So by the end of the project, 2,500 people would be displaced. They would remove 1,100 buildings. They would disinter 7,613 graves. They would flood 25,000 acres of land, and they would convert 56,000 acres of, agricultural and woodlot to a protected watershed forest. So they really did transform this valley from what it was then to what it is today. But we're here to talk about Dana. So Dana was one of the 4 towns. The other 3 were Enfield, Prescott, and Greenwich. Dana was on the northeast side of the valley. It was located east of Petersham, west of Greenwich and Prescott, and south of New Salem. It was actually named for a man named Justice Francis Dana, because he actually helped the residents found the town, and it was founded in 1801. And Dana Center was actually only one of 4 villages. So Dana Center was sort of on the southern part of the town. Really, the larger village was North Dana. North Dana developed into a larger village because it was right along the river, and the railway went right through North Dana. So it sort of became the economic center of the town. However, Dana Center had the political center. That's where the town hall was. 2 other smaller villages with Doubleday Village, which was between North Dana and Dana Center, and also Storesville. Both of those were basically like villages where families, extended families lived. But we're talking about Dana because Dana Center, is hikeable. North Dana is mostly underwater, as is Doubleday Village. So for those of you who have never hiked to Dana Common, this is a map of the current reservoir. It shows you all the gates and all the roads you can hike in. We're down here. We're a little bit off the map here. Windsor Dam's down here. But Dana Common is accessed through Gate 40, which is located off of 32A in Petersham. It's a 1.8-mile hike from the gate into Dana Common. So it's a little less than 4 miles of a walk. And you can hike in there, and you can bicycle on through Gate 40. That is one of the roads you can bike on, weather permitting. Right now, I don't think you can even snowshoe because the snow's too deep. And it is actually, I mean, just because of the length, I would call it a moderate hike, but it's relatively flat. It is a road that was formerly paved, so it's pretty smooth. And it is a very beautiful walk to take. So if you get a chance, if you're able to, in nicer weather, take a hike out there. So this is another one of those cool aerial photographs. This is Dana Common from the air. So if you were hiking from the gate, you would come down this road here. It was the Dana Petersham Road, and it would bring you down into the center. And here is the center. There are 3 roads that go out of the center. 2 of them would have taken you to parts of Greenwich, and then the one up here would have taken you to North Dana. These 2 actually end in the water. So someone asked me once, how do I know where the end of the road is? And I said, just keep walking until you get to the water. So Dana Common is the best preserved and the most easily accessible of the former villages that made up the pre-Quabbin Swift River Valley towns. So it actually is on the National Historic Register of Places, representing the valley itself. So this is actually a photograph from Google Earth that shows you Dana Common today. So here's the common right here. Here's the road that you would take coming in. Those are the 3 roads leaving the common. So very different. If we go back to the previous picture real quick, you can see all of that farmland, all the agricultural land. Obviously there was wooded areas. Everybody used wood to heat and to cook still, primarily back then. And also lumber was an important product of the valley. So there certainly was some forested area, but nowhere near as much as there is today. And Quabbin Reservoir is unique in a lot of the newer reforested areas in Massachusetts, and that is because it is highly managed, and it's managed to protect that water supply. So when you walk, not just on Dana Common, but when you walk through most of the hiking areas, you can see the signs of the past. Great time to walk when you're looking for these kind of signs is late fall or early winter if we don't have snow, and then in the spring before the trees leaf out, because that's when you can see the cellar holes and the stone walls very clearly, and those are the sort of big signs of the past. Other things as we get into springtime and summertime is you can see, particularly floral plants that were cultivated by people that live there. And it gives you an idea. They often are clustered around former homesteads. So those are some of the signs we can look for, which we'll be looking for virtually. But the other neat thing, I think, again, talking about how this valley was transformed to what it is today, is that Quabbin will be 88 years old this year, if we count its birth from 1938. And it has its own story. It has its own history. It's been alive for 88 years. So when you walk, you can also look for the changes in how we manage the land, and also how we've managed wildlife. And then also, better understand how we are protecting the water supply as you hike through the forest. So again, one of the unique things about Quabbin is because of the way that it was constructed, everything is recorded. So when they came to purchase the land from homeowners, and a reminder, of course, they did purchase the land from the homeowners. Eminent domain means you don't have a choice, but they do pay you what's considered market rate. Of course, this project took place during the 1930s, during the Great Depression, so market rate would have been depressed. So people may not have gotten the full value for their properties. But they came out and they surveyed all the property, and they drew these wonderful maps. Eventually, these maps will be scanned and made available to the public digitally. At this point, we have the original copies, and then we have small digital copies that we can provide to people when asked. And this particular area kind of has two maps that make up the walk we're going to take. So this map actually shows you where the gate is today. It's over here. And the road we will take goes along here. So this is where the gate would be. And the road goes along here. And what's the neat thing about it is that it helps us tell the story of the past, specifically who owned the property in the 1920s and 30s when the state was buying them. One of the things to remember is that, people, just like any other town, people were selling their property and leaving long before the reservoir was built. So you may have a connection to the valley, but you go and you look at the real estate images or records and you don't find your family records at all, because they would have sold to another individual who then would have sold to the state. And there was a situation at the time when the project was beginning where there were individuals in the valley who lived in the valley who started buying up their neighbor's property. Basically, to their neighbors, hey, I'll buy it. You can leave. You don't have to wait for the state process. So you will see sometimes that there are homeowners that look like they own a lot of property. For instance, an example in Dana is a man named Roland Doubleday. He seems like he owns a lot of property, but he would have bought it from his neighbors prior to him selling it all to the state. And you also have to remember, you again may have a connection to the valley, but your family may not have owned property. You may have rented. So it would be really difficult to search out that information without knowing who they rented from. Besides mapping the real estate, they also mapped all of the cemeteries. All of the known grave sites were located and mapped. And we, again, have all those records, which eventually will be scanned and made available digitally. But it's a lot of work, and scanning, takes a lot of money. But it is something that's really important to note, because there's a lot of misconceptions particularly around the removal of the cemeteries. They were very meticulous. They kept very good records. This particular map is of a cemetery called the Snow Family Cemetery. So it was in Petersham, although it is right inside Gate 40. And it had the vault of a man from Petersham who his story is kind of well known. So this was his vault, and it was on the north corner of the Snow Family Cemetery. His name was Asa Snow. His property at the time of the reservoir was owned by another family. Their last name was Stevens, I believe. But he was a little bit of a unusual character in his day. He was a vegetarian, probably because he worked as a meat cutter. Thinking he died in 1872. So if you think of his lifespan, vegetarianism in New England was probably pretty uncommon. He was like a lot of people in his era, where he was very, very afraid of being buried alive. This was a really common fear. It was so common that there actually was something sold called a grave bell. So it was a bell that was attached to the rope, and the rope was run down into the coffin. So the idea was if you were buried alive and you're in the coffin, you could ring the rope and ring the bell. And I don't know who was going to come and rescue you, but apparently it was pretty popular. Asa, however, did not buy a grave bell. What he did in his will was he specified that he not be buried underground. So he did die in 1872. He had his first wife preceded him, as well as a couple children died, and they were buried in the graveyard. He was married a second time when he died, and in his will he asked that, as I said, he be buried in a vault above ground and with a glass cover to his coffin. And he specified that before they closed the vault, that he be checked on for 7 days to make sure he was actually dead. So this is the vault. If you don't know what a vault is, it's basically a little structure, and coffins would be slid in, and then the entrance would be sealed, in this case with a marble headstone. So he died. The undertaker followed the directions, but then there was a snowstorm similar to what we just had last week. And the undertaker then went to his widow and said, "Hey, I couldn't get there for a couple days. I'm really sorry." And she's like, "You know what? He's dead. Just close it up." A little ironically, when they removed the cemetery, or they built the cemetery and started to remove the graves, they did disinter, or they reopened Asa's vault. Now, he would have been dead. He died in 1872, so he would have been dead for close to 50 years. And there were no records of a glass top coffin in the vault. And his family would have been the ones who would have decided where their family's bodies will be interred at the new cemetery in Ware, the Quabbin Park Cemetery. And they would have chosen for him to be buried underground. And here is his new headstone that's in place at the new cemetery. And it lists him and his first wife, his children, and I believe his second wife as well. A little bit down the road, one of the first cellar holes you might see past the Snow Cemetery area, which you can't really see where the cemetery was anymore, but there was a farm owned by a man named Monroe Berry. And this would be the cellar hole, typical of regular households in New England in this time. You know, when we think of cellars or basements, we usually think they're as large as the whole house. You know, modern houses, it's, you know, the cemetery, the cellar is as big as the house foundation. That was not the case. Historically, cellar holes were pretty small areas, and foundations were actually not attached to them. House foundations were not attached, and that's because it actually was not uncommon for people to sort of move their houses every so often. And cellar holes are all over New England woods. It just so happens in Quabbin, we know who they belong to. And you can see that it would have been pretty small. It would have been used, you know, to store some, you know, maybe cider or root vegetables through the winter to keep things cool, sort of an area of preservation. So I talked about how the Quabbin has its own history. And one of the things I don't think a lot of people realize is that, as I said at the beginning, this was primarily, it was like 50% agricultural land. So when the state, after they cleared all of the structures in the 1940s, as the reservoir was filling, they started actually to reforest the area. So this is a photograph of one of the areas very close to Dana Center, formerly owned by John Price, where they were planting red and white pines to reforest the area. They chose those because they mature quickly, and they wanted to have a mature forest in a short period of time. Red pines were pretty popular for them to plant. They were non-native, but they would have been mature in 20 years, which is what they were going for. So this is a current picture of the road to Dana Common, and you can see along the side here all of these trees. If you're looking closely, you could probably guess, are they the same species of tree? You think so? Yeah. So one of the ways you can tell it was a pine plantation is if you look at them, they're all very closely close together in a straight line. You know, so they were all planted. And you can identify the red pines today because they have been affected by something called a red pine scale starting in 2009. It is an insect that is going to kill the red pines. It has been killing the red pines since 2009. It's been moving up from New Jersey since the 50s. So when we started to change the way we manage the forest after the Great Drought in the 1960s, one of the things they focused on was starting to harvest a lot of those pine trees. If you stop and think about it, pine trees, they're evergreens, they're conifers, they take up water all year round. And they're also, in the case of the red pines, they're non-native. So they shifted the forestry management to harvest a lot of these red pines to allow a more native forest to regenerate. So when you do walk the Quabbin Forest or the Quabbin Park, you will see these pine plantations. There's still a few of them around. And generally speaking, they don't look super healthy because they will all die. So as I said, changes in land management. They started redoing it in the 70s, really picked up in the 80s. And we have, every 10 years now, we do have to write a land management plan. The newest one will be produced in 2027. So it's every 10 years as an agency, we have to go and we have to look at how the land is managed, what will we change, what will we do. And obviously there's a different and better understanding, hopefully a better understanding of how land can be sustainably, how a forest can be sustainably managed, which is what has been leading us since the 1980s. So when you are walking, this is another section of the Dana Common Road, you may also see forest like this one, which is not all of the same species of trees. So you'll see more oak, you'll see a lot of black birch, you'll see white pine, and you also see different species of maple as well. And the goal is to promote a forest that has diverse ages and diverse species, and a forest that is resistant to disruption, like from wind or disease or insects, things like that. So along with managing the land, we have very active management of our forest, is that we actually also do manage the wildlife to a certain extent. So this area was highly agricultural. A lot of the species we're starting to take for granted, like black bear, like turkey, wild turkey, and even moose, either did not have any population in Massachusetts or only had a really small population in the western part of the state. But planting this forest created a woodland habitat for a lot of these animals, so they did start to return to Massachusetts, or in some cases be reintroduced to Massachusetts. And so that led, this repopulation of woodland species has led to a repopulation of a lot of different woodland species. For example, this moose here. Moose returned to Massachusetts probably about 35 to 40 years ago because they had been extirpated from Massachusetts by the early 1800s because of loss of habitat and hunting. But now they estimate about 1,000 moose, about 100 of them in the Quabbin area. So what that then led to is that wildlife can have an impact on the forest. And in the case of our forest, everything is driven by water protection. Our goal is to have this healthy, diverse forest that is so it will protect the water. And certain species can have a negative impact, specifically for many years, the deer. So we have white-tailed deer living in Massachusetts. And once the reservoir was built, we did not allow hunting at all of any kind in the Quabbin Forest. So the Quabbin deer population grew and was actually not allowing the forest to regenerate. Deer like to eat young trees. So the young saplings were being eaten by the deer. So our forest was getting older with no new younger trees to repopulate. So looking at different ways of managing deer, and in 1991, we did institute a controlled deer hunt, which still continues to this day. It has migrated into different management styles, but what is left behind on Dana Common is this little shack here. And when I take kids on a hike, down Dana Common. A lot of times like, oh, is that a house that was left behind? It is not. It is a shack that's there for our employees to check hunters in and out when they are hunting this area. But so beyond deer, other wildlife that we're specifically concerned about are things like gulls and geese, because their fecal matter can contaminate the drinking water. However, our wildlife biologists also are looking at and monitoring all different kinds of wildlife species. So what we have is we have this great diversity of wildlife like turkey, which, believe it or not, there were no wild turkey in Massachusetts from about 1851 to about 1972. So that's a really long period there. No wild turkeys in Massachusetts. They were reintroduced in the early 70s. And obviously, if you live in this area at least, you have all seen a wild turkey, right?
Oh, God.
Right. And actually, they're pretty well spread throughout Massachusetts. And they're great birds. They are fun to watch. They are super smart. And they're actually pretty tough. But besides turkey, I mentioned the moose, black bear. We have a really healthy population of black bear. We've got bobcat, we've got mink, and many, many more types of birds and small mammals, fur-bearing mammals, in part because we have this very healthy forest here at Quabbin. So here's the second map for this area of the Dana Center Road. And so here's Dana Center down here. And so if we follow the road back, this is the way you would be walking past all of these properties before you came into the common area itself. And one of the big things that you would see, especially when it is not summer, is you would see the Carter home property. So you don't really see the foundation of the home so much. You do see the barn foundation. So this is the barn that was there. It's a very typical barn. And what's left is this very big stone wall. So when you're taking a hike in the woods, you come across a large stone foundation like this, you can say, aha, that was a barn. So the Carter home was owned by a man, and George Carter and his wife. But they actually bought the property in 1921, so not that long before it was sold to the state. Prior to that, for many, many years, this property actually was the town farm for the town of Dana. If you are unfamiliar with what a town farm was, it was a property that was owned and managed by the farm, and it housed indigent people, people that were homeless. Typically, the residents there tended to be older, people without family in the area, but there oftentimes too sometimes were young women with children, maybe who had been widowed or hadn't had a husband. And one sort of famous resident of Dana, whose name was Walter Myron Smith, who became an actor in the late 1900s, he and his mother and brother lived at the town farm when he was a young boy. His younger brother was actually born there. So town farm, poor farm. For those of us that live in towns around here, how many of you know that there's a town farm road in your town? There is. It would have been the road that went by the town farm. A little bit down the road is this little property, which I don't know a whole lot about this family. I like the lady's name, Lula. It's very pretty. But what I really like about their property is the foundation. It's a little different. Actually, I'm going to go back. If you look, their house sort of sits up on this little rise here. It's just a cape, probably maybe two and a half bedroom cape. But you can see the foundation here. And what's neat now, it's got trees growing out of the foundation, but in the springtime, it is covered in violets and also some lily of the valleys. So those are those cultivated plants, non-native plants that maybe Lula Spooner planted in front of her doorstep, and they've done really well. And it's beautiful, beautiful to see. Their barn foundation is across the street from their house foundation, but it is, to me, actually one of the most beautiful ones in the forest. Some other things that you can see when you're paying attention is you'll see all the stone walls. Of course, we'll talk a little bit more about those. But what you see is you'll see these breaks in the stone wall. And those are deliberate breaks. They were known as barways, and there would have been a wooden bar across here. And it was, it was a separation between two fields. The fields might have been used for different reasons. One could have been a crop field, one could have been a pasture, and you'd have, a break in the wall so you could get your equipment or your livestock between the two fields. Oftentimes, nowadays, of course, a lot of stone walls, they're sort of tumbling. So sometimes you're like, is that a barway or is that a stone wall that has started to fall apart? You can tell the barways because they will have a vertical large stone at the edge of it. So we're heading pretty close. We're getting close to the common now. So we've probably walked about a mile, maybe a little over a mile. And this was the blacksmith shop that was in the town of Dana. And it was sold to the state by a man named Roland Doubleday. So that he was a member of the Doubleday family, which is a very large extended family from the valley. And what's left is this part of right in front of the where the structure is, where the foundation is. But it does have a little bit of a history, a family history for the people that owned it, who sold it to Roland Doubleday. And we'll get up to that when we reach their house. Oh, here we are. This is a detail of the map. So the Doubleday, the blacksmith right there. And we're going to be walking down this road right into the common itself. And we're fortunate that there's a couple of groups, the Swift River Valley Historical Society and the Friends of Quabbin, that both have a collection of historic photographs that they share with us. And this is a great view walking into Dana, the center of Dana. So here's the road, the blacksmith shop's over here a little bit. This is actually a house that was owned by a man named John Price. And you saw his property was used actually as some of the reforestation in this area. This is one of the churches. This was the Orthodox Congregational Church in Dana Center. And then this little house is what we're going to talk about next. So this was owned by a woman named Josephine Marcille. She sold it to the state. Her and her children lived here. Her husband's name was Moses Marcille. From their names, I assume they were of French-Canadian descendants. And at the time we're talking about, in the early 1900s, you did start to see a small number of people, more recent immigrants from different parts of Europe and French Canada coming into the valley here. Historically, it would have been a lot more of the sort of English Yankee settlers. But Josephine and her husband lived in this house with their family. Moses operated the blacksmith down the road. And they have kind of a tragic story. There's no young people here. A little bit of a tragic story. So they did have a lot of problems financially. And for a while, they relocated to Fall River, but then they came back to Dana in 1907. And Moses actually had spent some time in a institution for someone who is mentally ill. And he came back home, and one day after dinner, he went into the bedroom, came back out with a shotgun, shot his wife, and then killed himself. So he actually did not kill his wife. She survived, and she lived in this house in Dana until she sold it and then moved away in the mid-1920s. Just a kind of an interesting little codicil experience that I had was, we have people who come here to do genealogy from their families. We hold the vital records for the 4 towns, so the birth records, death records, marriage records. So there was a group of 3 young women that came in, and they were looking for information about this family. So I brought out, we have the actual books, and I brought out the books for them to look at. And when they told me their name, I'm like, oh, well, that was probably something, a sad story. And they looked at me and they're like, I don't know what you're talking about. So there's a book called Strange Tales, written by a local historian, J.R. Green. And I brought it out for them to read the story of the Marcilles. And it was interesting because they read it, and they were probably like her great-grandchildren or something. And they're like, oh, wow, that explains a lot. So, it's one of those things where as a young person, you have these inklings of things in your family history that the older people will never talk about. And then when you learn about it, you're like, oh, okay, that explains it. But talking about the house itself, right back here, this little sort of piece that's on the back of this house, that actually was a root cellar. And this is the root cellar today. So we do, our staff actually does clear the brush out of the cellar holes at Dana Common on a maybe every year or so. And so the cellar hole is one of those, the root cellar here behind the Marseille house is one of the things that you can go and you can look at, you get an idea of what a root cellar will look like. It is big enough to stand in. It's pretty substantial.
How many kids?
But it was more than 3. That's a good question. I don't know. I don't know. Maybe was she a seamstress? Did you take a laundry? Were her kids old enough where they went out and work? Good question. I should look into that.
Sorry.
No, that's okay.
I have that strange.
Yeah. Oh, do you? Okay.
Go back.
It might have been also in the historic hikes. I can't remember which one. Anyway, so right next to the Marseilles was one of the churches or actually the church in Dana Center. There wasn't any other churches in the center. There were other churches in the town. And it was founded in the 1830s, and the building was built shortly after it was founded. I think, and it was known as the Orthodox Congregational Society of Dana Center. It was active right until the town was disestablished, and they actually donated their bell to, I think it was a church in Brookfield. So this is what is left of the church foundation. And then this is, oh, yep.
That's a good question.
Yep.
That's the one that's got all the cobblestones in it, right? Kind of cemented with.
Well, actually, that's one of the houses we're going to talk about in a minute. Okay, so the church actually, this isn't a great view of the foundation, but it's basically just a cellar hole.
Okay.
So this is, oops, let me go back. There we go. This is basically the church foundation. Over here is, we're going to talk about, that's
Okay, thank you.
another historic photograph of this is the view of Dana Common that we would see as we come in from this point from the Peter Sam Road. And you can see there's a town sign directing you which way to go to Greenwich or North Dana, and the corner of the common itself, which is still there. And here's the view you see today. So this gentleman here mentioned one of the houses that has, and I have a better picture of the wall, but it's this wall over here.
Oh,
And it's Riverstone, and it was owned by a man named Edgar Vaughn, and his son actually built that wall. And this is a photograph that's taken from the back. So the view we had was over here looking at the front of the house. This is the back view. And this is the Riverstones. So they built that themselves. They collected all the Riverstones and cemented them together. And so, yeah, it's pretty impressive. This section here has been repaired. There's a funny story of a man named Earl Cooley. He grew up in Dana. He lived there, I think, until about the age of 13. And his house was just a little bit down the road here. And his story is that when he was a kid, he took out of the barn a cart. He like ran between the traces like a horse, and he was pulling it behind him and running back and forth across the road. And he actually hit the wall and knocked the stones out. And he never told anybody until he was adult. The wall was actually fixed by our staff before this became the historic register ceremony. So another view from across the common. So there's the church. There's the Vaughn house. This house right here, this really pretty French mansard style house, was owned by a woman named Marion Johnson. She inherited it from her father. Her father was a judge. And we're fortunate that there's a lot of memories that have been shared to both us and the Friends of Quabbin and the Swift River Valley Historical Society. So there's a lot of oral history. And one of the stories that people shared is that Marion actually played the harp. So she would be in her house on a summer night with the windows open, playing her harp, and everyone would gather out. Sort of, her house was right across from the common here. People would be hanging out in the common, listen to her play. And then when she was done, she'd invite everybody in for cookies and lemonade. So I do always share that story with children. I try to give kids a sense of what life was like for kids back then. And one of the things I did have a kid say to me, she's like, well, you can't go in the house of someone you don't know, which is actually a very good thing for her to know. And I would say, well, everyone knew her and they knew it was safe, so they could go in and they could get cookies from her. And this is Marion Johnson's house cellar hole here. She lived across this road from the Vaughns, and then Earl Cooley, actually, his family lived down the road a little bit. So this is the view. If you go down the road a little bit, there was a store owned at the time of the reservoir being built by a man named Howard Cotton. And the hotel was across the street. This was the Eagle Hotel. It actually was the oldest hotel in Dana. It had several different owners over the years. It was owned by a man named David Kennedy when the state purchased the property. And it was one of many little hotels that people might come and spend a week or so in the country enjoying the fresh air and going fishing and bicycling, things like that. Well, I mean, I'm comparing it to a hotel today. And this is the site of the hotel now. Here's the cellar hole. And then this beautiful maple right in front of it. This here is actually a sign that they're arranged around the common. It was actually part of a Girl Scout gold medal project. Earl Cooley's granddaughter, her name was, blanking on her name. I want to say it was Kathy. I don't think that's right. Anyway, his granddaughter, that for her gold medal project, she did a neat little marking the putting in posts with photographs marking the progress. So a little bit sort of diagonally from the hotel was the Dana Center Cemetery. So there are actually two cemeteries in Dana Center. One was Dana Center, and then the Brown Cemetery was on the other side of the school in the townhouse. And so it was right in the middle of the town, which was not unusual. And it is, again, something when I talk to kids or even adults, it's a good reminder that, you know, people in the days we're talking about, they lived much closer to death than we do today. So you would always have, you know, close vision on your relatives that had died. And every Memorial Day or Decoration Day, as they used to call it, you would go and you would clean the great headstones and you'd plant new flowers. And kids probably played in the cemetery all the time because that building right behind you here was actually the school. And here, actually, these stones are left from the cemetery. That was the entrance to the cemetery. And this cellar hole is, as I said, the school. So here was the Dana Center School. It was one of two schools in Dana. In the early 20th century, Massachusetts went through education reform, and that's when all those little mini schoolhouses were closed, and towns had to consolidate. And in a lot of towns like the size of Dana, there maybe were only one or two schools. The Dana Center one housed the younger grades, and then the upper grades would go up to North Dana. And when I say the younger grades, I say probably maybe first through fourth grade. It was not uncommon at the age of 13 or 14 for children to be done with former schooling. So by the time if you graduated from 8th grade, then you would go and you would get a full-time job. That was not uncommon in those days. So one of the neat things about this picture is that there is a set of playground equipment. There's a slide, and there's a seesaw, and there's actually kids playing on it. So one of the things about these real estate photographs is that they did in some cases capture regular life. Pictures of dogs or kids sledding and things like that, or in this case, kids playing in front of the school. So the building behind it is the town hall. The town hall looks a lot like a church, and that's because it originally was a church. It was originally located in Petersham. It was a Baptist church, and they sold the building to the town of Dana, and it became their town hall. So this is the cellar hall for the school. The town hall is right next door. I don't have a picture of that one though, but looks pretty much the same. And then the common itself, which the school and the cemetery were right across from the common. And this is actually the photograph of the last Memorial Day in Dana, so it's 1932. This is the War Memorial, and the War Memorial actually was relatively new. It was emplaced in, I think, 1924, and I would guess that they were spurred to do it by the end of World War I. So it does list all of the people who served, people from Dana who served from the Revolutionary War all the way through World War I. It was moved to the Quabbin Park Cemetery, and it is located there. When you come in the entrance of the cemetery on the left, all of the town monuments are clustered together there. Dana Common actually does, or Dana Cemetery actually does have the name of one woman. Her name was Hattie Doan, and she was a Red Cross nurse volunteer during World War I. Really interesting woman. And if you are unfamiliar with the experiences that the Red Cross nurse has had during World War I, it was pretty intense. They call them volunteers, but they basically were members of the military. They did not get recognized as such. They were just volunteers. But it was a pretty intense experience. So, and here's the common today. There was both the the War Memorial, as well as a Civil War cannon that were located in this area here. And today, this is the newest monument that was placed there in 2000, I want to say 2015, I'm not sure. I can't remember exactly, but it was when the Dana Common was listed on the National Register of Historic Places, and it marks the age of the town, when it began, or when it was first settled. It actually wasn't founded until 1801, to when it was disestablished in 1938. There is another stone monument that was put in place by residents of Dana. They had formed a group called the Dana Reunion, and it is right on the edge of the common, and again has the same information saying in memory of those who had to leave, and gives the dates of the town. And then this is a view of the common from the opposite end where you would have walked in. So you walk in over here. This is a panoramic view. So the hotel was over here, cemetery is here, school and town hall is there, Vaughn House, Johnson House over here. And you can see the linden trees, which were a pretty common tree to be planted on the commons. And they're really attractive tree, and they actually have a really sweet smell in the spring. So those are still there. So that ends our hike. At this point, we're all walking back. All right. So I will take questions from the room first, and then hopefully we'll be able to get questions from people at home as well. Yep. Sure.
You know, evermore years, but it used to be tar.
Yep.
Road. How did I use a handicap? Is it still tar?
So the question was, the road to the common was paved with tar, macadam, whatever you want to call it. So it is still paved. I think if you have the type, he was interested in getting in with a handicap vehicle, not a vehicle, but a wheelchair or trike. If you have the thicker wheels, are they like thicker wheels? Because it would be, yeah, I think you'd be fine. So. Just bring water.
Somewhere in Dana was a sawmill that was left. I mean, the sawmill was removed, but the sawdust pile was left. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of people, the family and so forth, that when they left, they had to leave their dogs behind, or they chose to leave. And I remember them being bred in the sawdust pile. I've never found them. But we always were affected by it when we hunt the perimeter when the dogs chasing deer.
Okay, so the gentleman here shared a story that there was a sawmill that was removed, but the sawdust was left behind, pile of sawdust, and that he was told that people left their dogs when they had to leave. So let me just say, the state did not make people leave the dogs behind. It probably was a question where they couldn't afford to take them, right? And that the dogs were in in the forest, basically living, and would harass deer. So I have never heard that story. It is not a problem at this date at all. So.
Okay, I mean, we used to see it in their own dishes, almost like wild.
Sure. I don't, you know, I mean, I also point out that 1930s is when eastern coyotes started to appear in New England. So eastern coyotes have been identified as a hybrid between wolves and western coyotes, so they do not have domestic dog DNA. So sometimes people call them coy dogs, but they don't have domestic dog DNA. So I don't know. I mean, it's also something that did people hunt those dogs?
Or are you suggesting that maybe they weren't dogs, but they were coyotes?
That is what I am suggesting. They could very well have been wild dogs. I don't know.
So the ones I remember to see, but there was a lot of hounds, beagles that were attracted deer, and then there was these bigger, muscular dogs behind them that would take the deer down.
So yeah, not an issue anymore.
Just-
Yeah, no, that's a memory. That's a good one. Go ahead.
Wells
Oh, yes.
associated, so I'm just thinking of walking around and be careful about those. Anyway,
Right. So we would encourage you to always stay on the road. We would discourage you from wandering off into the woods. If there are wells, they have, you know, that typically we would have filled them in at some point. So, but yeah, you do have to be careful of those. But again, we encourage everyone to stay on the road. So anyway.
There are some that are just a little stone. It's in the pool.
You're gonna need to watch your steps.
Yeah, go ahead.
Was the reservoir funded state of Massachusetts?
So the reservoir was funded and continues to be funded by the people who drink the water. So it is water rate users.
But the cost of building it originally.
So the cost of it built originally, they might have floated bonds, but the bonds would have been paid off with using water user rate money. So it is not and never has been funded by the general taxpayer.
Can you explain about the plane and?
Oh, that's right.
So the plane crash is located outside of Dana Common. It's on your way towards gate 43. So it's actually another maybe 4 miles past Dana Common. And it is the crash of a military plane. The gentleman was flying from central New York back to the Westfield Air Base, south of Quabbin, and he encountered turbulence and had to evacuate the plane, and the plane went down. So the remains of the plane were left there. That is actually the regulation from the National Transportation Board. So they would do an investigation, and whether or not was it pilot error or whatever caused the crash. And those things are supposed to be left there. People do unfortunately have taken stuff over there over the years, but it is still there. And there is kind of a neat end to the story where the man did survive. And I think 80s or 90s, he actually came back and talked to the Boy Scout troop in this area and shared his story. So it's kind of that's a neat little piece of it. So there is a gravestone outside of Dana, and it's pretty famous. It's the gravestone of a young boy. His name was Wendell Farnsworth. So it is a gravestone. Whether or not there's a grave that is associated with the stone, we don't know. But yeah, I mean, there were occasions where headstones or graves were left behind because it was all of the known graves. So they did do an extensive amount of research. Besides looking at records, they interviewed older residents of the towns. They interviewed cemetery commissioners and town clerks. And they worked very, very hard to try and remove as many graves as possible. But yes, that headstone at least was left behind.
Is the reason that they removed everything, even in areas where it didn't flood, was because to have people continue to live there or to have structures continue to be there would contaminate the groundwater?
Yes. So That's why they took, so if you compare how much land we manage compared to Wachusett Reservoir, I mean, I actually don't know the acreage of the land that Wachusett Reservoir has, but we have 2/3 as much forest as we have water.
Right.
And so when they designed it, the idea was they took actually almost all of the Swift River watershed. So we all live in watersheds. A watershed is the area of land where the rain and the snow shed, quote unquote, shed off the land into a body of water. And in the case of an unfiltered or naturally filtered water supply, the more land you protect, the better you are protecting the water. So it was planned that way, and that's why they had everyone leave.
So within the design,
Yeah.
but they had to take it within those reasons.
It made it much easier for them to protect it. So I can't tell if I have any questions. I don't know. No questions? Were there any at all that came in? Oh, okay, great. All right, well, I hope the people at home were able to hear, and I appreciate everyone's patience in the room. And
Thank you.
enjoy the weather, and you know, we do occasional hikes in Dana Common, so if you keep your eye out, you can join us on a hike, but it is open to the public year round if weather permitting.
Thank you very much.
Are there any
You end the recording, Nancy?